This is a weird HO scale Santa Fe FT, and today I'm going to be trying to restore it again. For those who are unaware, this is a really weird locomotive. It's really oddly proportioned, and this was made by a company called ATT. The thing was actually produced by Mahano, apparently, in the 60s or 70s. It's a really weird thing, and it does not look all that accurate. And last time, when I went in and tried to fix this thing, I had some issues with the gearing in the rear truck, and also discovered there was a defect in the motor, which meant that this thing would not live, and it was going to be in my parts bin for the foreseeable future. However, since then, I've done a few modifications. What I've done is I actually got a really cheap C-liner that had no shell or anything, and I took the chassis out of it. So all I have is the front truck here with wires coming out of it, and the rear truck here with the motor. The modifications I had to do, I had to screw this in. I put it in about as center as possible, but these trucks are not very centered, so it was rather difficult. I've got the wires here. And then I also had to modify the way I mounted the motor because it's the same motor style. However, on the C-liners, they're held in by this little pin. So I just drilled 2 holes on each end, really close to each other. I've done all these modifications, however, that doesn't mean there's still stuff to be done. This front truck needs some oil, and it needs to be wired up to the brushes here, which means I need to wire in wires at 2 different points. And this whole rear truck needs some fresh oil, and I would also like to wire in a light and see if I can get a rear coupler on here. So, let's get to work on this thing, and I'm gonna start by heating up my soldering iron and just trying to get this thing wired properly. While I wait for the soldering iron to heat up, there is still a few things I can do. I do need to remove the brushes because I'm going to try and solder the wires onto this little strip right here, if possible. It might actually be better for me to do it right on this corner, so I'll probably try and do that. But for me to accomplish that, I've got to remove both of these brushes. Next up, I'm just going to strip some of these wires, just because that needs to be done really quickly. Now, these are the wires I will be using, which I will probably need to cut just a little bit to get to the right length. Next up, I would like to tin this first brush. I am actually going to be soldering the wires right to here because I feel like that will actually be the best spot for these. Now I'll do the same with the other brush. Perfect. That is both brushes soldered and tinned, so now we can move on to the actual wires themselves. Right there, that's not perfect, but it'll look better once I cover it up with some heat shrink tubing. Now that these have had enough time to cool off, I'm going to melt these 2 wires in the brush together. Perfect, that's one, and hopefully this one will be wire number 2. There, that looks good. While the brushes are out of here and they're cooling off, I figured that I'll clean them off with some rubbing alcohol, and then that'll mean we don't have to deal with those too much later. Now the brushes get to go back into the chassis. I'm not going to clean off the commutator because it looks pretty good already. I don't think cleaning it's going to do very much. Perfect. Before we go wiring this together, I'm just going to quickly test this motor, make sure it still works, and that wiring this up didn't mess anything up. The motor still operates. It is a little bit noisy still because that's just how these things are, and it still needs some fresh oil. Next up, we've got to tin these two wires and then wire up the actual wires here, and hopefully I've got them in the right direction. I'll test it very briefly afterwards just to see how it's working, and if needed, I'll flip them around. Alright, perfect. We've got this thing wired up. I'm just going to go test it out, see if this thing actually functions, and if not, I will reverse the direction and see what's wrong with it. Very briefly, let me just show you how this thing operates. It's pretty noisy going forwards. It's slightly quieter going backwards. Hopefully some fresh oil will fix that. If not, this is kind of how these AHM motors operate, and I won't be too surprised. I just really think this thing needs to run. And I've also checked. The polarity of this thing is correct. It runs in the same direction as several of my other engines that I know have proper polarity. Good news! The most annoying part of this restoration for me is over. I've gotten everything wired up. I even wired up a headlight. I just need to clean up this connection a little bit just so I make absolutely certain I don't ever have any shorts here. But I think this thing is going to turn out pretty nicely. And now it is time for me to grab my engine cradle, and we can actually get to work on both the front truck and the rear truck. I'm going to start with the front. However, something of note that's going to be key with a lot of these older engines is some of them actually have, I'll see if I can find it on the rear truck, they've got a little nut right here that holds this thing on, so I have to be very careful when taking this thing apart to not lose that. I do have a whole bunch of spares from the parts engines I got for this thing. I did not spend very much acquiring parts engines, which is good, especially considering this engine was only $2.50. So my cost in this thing is still under $10 for such an odd engine, which I think if I wanted to, I could pretty easily get back. Perfect. While I'm taking a quick break, I'm going to see if I've got a nicer part than this in my spares, because I feel like I've got one of these that's in nicer shape that we can use, because I'd rather not have a rusty one on this interesting looking engine. 10 seconds later, after digging through my organized parts bin, I actually found one that wasn't even off any of my parts engines. It's got a little bit of rust, but I don't think that one's going to be ridiculously bad. Also, judging by the looks of it in here, I'm going to clean off the wheels themselves, but I think everything else in here is just going to need a little bit of fresh oil. You know what? This piece is not going to work on this engine. It is too short. So I'm actually going to go get one from my parts bin, like I should have in the first place, and just replace it with one from one of my other parts engines of a C-liner. Perfect. Before I forget about it, I'm going to give this top bearing some oil. And then it's time to move on to this truck, which luckily I should have easier access to the parts this time. Compared to the original motor truck this thing had on it, this is much, much better. Now it's time to clean all this stuff out. I'm going to be giving these things some new traction tires after we go through and deal with everything. Just because I want to, I think it might improve performance, and I think when I was testing this thing out, it was slipping a little bit. So just out of my own safety and curiosity, I'm going to swap them over. Alright, before we get to dealing with all the fresh oil, I'm just going to put new traction tires on these wheels off camera because it's a bit of an annoying process. Alright, these wheels now have traction tires on them. The old ones are far from the worst I've seen, considering they actually came off in one piece, but they did seem a little bit to have a lack of grip and seemed a little dry. So they've been replaced. Now I'm going to give this little motor bearing right here some fresh oil, then I'll put some grease on the worm gear, then we will put all the gears in, give those fresh oil, and then we can close this back up and test it out. I don't know if that's the exact same way I originally put these wheels in. However, since this side in this truck does not actually pick up any power whatsoever, I think it'll be just fine. I do want to see, if at all possible, if I can fit a Kadee in here before we fully reassemble this thing. So I'll try and do that, and I'll probably come back once I've either got a Kadee in or have failed to get a Kadee in. Through the use of some Kadee washers and some nuts, I've actually gotten this thing perfectly into place. Well, not perfectly. The coupler's seated right. It is a little bit low though, which is fine by me. This isn't going to be pulling many insane consists. This would just kind of be something fun to have around my house. So I'll put this one last screw into here. And now we can finally put the shell back on. In theory, we should be able to test this thing, and finally, it should actually run. It is finally time to give this thing a test run and see, with all that work, if it'll actually work and run fairly decently. Let's give this thing some power. The light's flickering because it's only directional and comes on forward. That's kind of what these LEDs do. Let's go forwards. This thing is a little bit noisy, however, it does actually run. It's a little bit quieter in reverse. Let me let this thing do a lap, and we'll come back after that. So this thing does run pretty smoothly, but it is quite loud. While this locomotive is far from a quiet runner, it runs just about as well as I would have expected it to. It's such a neat piece of history that is a really odd locomotive, and this is something that I think needed to run regardless of how quiet it is. So, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this thing getting a second chance at revival.